healthy men beautiful, healthy men who were getting opportunistic infections. That one of them was Kaposi sarcoma. That's a cancer, that ugly cancer, that blood type things on you that usually only old men in the southern tip of Italy get. And so it's like, why is it at UCLA? And so we were starting to see around the world pockets of disease that made no sense. Different TB, thrush, different kind of infections that we call opportunistic infections now. We didn't at the time. So everybody was looking, and because Frank had already discovered the first retrovirus, understanding what he understood about how they work, we thought this could be a retrovirus. And then Luc Montagnier, Nobel laureate, called Frank one day and said, hey, we're gonna send people and have you to Bob Gallo's lab and our postdoc, and have him help teach us how to isolate the virus. And Frank told him I wouldn't do that. And he told him exactly why. And history did repeat itself, but we won't go there right now. So we go ahead and we said, we'll help you. We'll teach you. And it was just the two of us. Frank wasn't allowed to have more than one technician for quite a number of years because, again, he was getting too much credit. So we isolated the virus from the saliva and the blood of one of the patients, from the original patients from the French Canadian. You really need to go back to the original patients in cohorts because there can be strain differences and it'll look different. So you really want that sick person. If they're not sick, you're not likely to isolate the virus or find it there. And that's really critical when you think about, I mentioned that we isolated it from saliva. So would that mean that HIV is contagious in that way, where if you share water or wine or meals or get it on the food, you can actually become infected? And that didn't turn out to be true unless you were with the sickest of patients. So yes, we isolated them there, but you wouldn't consider that virus contagious. Anyway, we isolated it and we had a paper in press. I'm a technician. Technicians don't co-author papers, not in that time. They do now, but they didn't then. So Frank was out of town at a meeting. I'm the technician. We have one office and one lab, so I answer the phone. And it's Bob Gallo, and Tony Fauci. I think Tony Fauci was on the phone. And the office doors open so that the rest of the students and techs can hear me. And I answered the phone, and he said, I understand you have a manuscript in press. We need a copy of it. And Dr. Rossetti. I said, Dr. Rossetti's out of town. I'm sorry, it's confidential. It's in press. It's unethical for me to give that to you. And he started literally screaming at me. Both of them were on the call. I could hear Bob Gallo's voice that I now know. And they're in Bethesda. We're in Frederick. And he's like, give me the paper or you're fired for insubordination. Well, I just got fired a minute ago, so I'm pretty good at that. It's like, it's not a problem right now because I'm starting to understand how the government works. And I just said, I'm sorry, it's unethical and I can't give it to you. I'm sure when Dr. Rossetti comes back, he'll give you a copy of the paper. But this was a problem, you see, because Bob Gallo couldn't isolate the virus. So when Frank came back, he bullied him into giving him a copy of the paper. They held up our paper in press, Frank's paper in press, and while Bob Gallo copied the results and came out with his own paper and said, hey, we discovered it first, and it's not your virus. We got it from other samples, not the ones that you sent. So we've got a new virus. And history really repeats itself because it's so clear in the 30 years later, literally exactly what happened to Frank Rossetti happened to me as our careers were ruined, and similarly. So, and that's part of the story in Plague of Corruption. So once we learned in 2014 what this story was all about, then we wrote the simple book. Plague of Corruption is what I now understand. It had nothing to do, because we were looking at otherwise healthy men, beautiful, healthy men who were getting opportunistic infections. That one of them was Kaposi sarcoma. Hooker gave a talk August 31st, 2014, and he showed a page of the notebook of William Thompson, the guy who confessed that he covered up for 20 years and committed fraud in a scientific paper that vaccines, MMR, can and does cause autism in susceptible little black boys under the age of 3. The fourfold risk if little black boys are given that vaccine before the age of 3. And his notebook page had a taped in email to everyone on the project, which the authors of the paper, which you have to do. And it said in his handwriting, what are we gonna do about the problem with the blacks? And
Who said this again?
Dr. Thompson. And Dr. Hooker dogged him for 15 years, who had an injured son, and dogged him for 15 years with FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. So that the light bulb went on that day after we wrote that incredibly scientific book, Plague, and I thought it was about science. So just like I was explaining a few minutes ago, I thought this was all about science. And the big, oh my God, is this has nothing to do with science. This is a big cover up, and some of our work had shown that same thing.
Can we go back to your experience with Dr. Anthony Fauci? At that time, he's 79 years old right now, so 1984, we're talking about
45.
He was 45. But who was he? Already a credible voice? Was he somebody that was as was he as known, was he as powerful, or not yet?
Not yet, but he was a credible voice, but he didn't I don't think he got the job as the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease until, the paper with HIV, because that's one of the things he said was, I want to be on the Tonight Show. They didn't care about millions of people dying. It's like, how are they going to position themselves? And it was horrible to watch.
Who said this? He said this?
Yeah. And so Cliff Lane, Bob Gallo, and Tony Fauci all had their reasons for, publishing second this paper, for taking the credit away from Luc Montagnier and the French and making this all their own. They held up, and they did that. They held up the paper so it wouldn't get published for months. They held up a diagnostic test. They wrote the patents to themselves for the discoveries, which weren't theirs. And you can see many things about this in books like science fictions and things like that. You can see through Charles Ortlieb's new book on Tony Fauci. But Charles was an advocate in New York. And he was writing about both chronic fatigue syndrome and HIV and AIDS when we didn't know much about it. And they were accusing the government of keeping the drugs, keeping the things away from people. And they were, of course, right. So he basically changed, let this disease spread around the world so that he could get glory, fame, and money.
So at this point,
Hooker gave it to
HIV, AIDS, the number I read about right now is 32 million people have died from it, and 40 million people in Africa have HIV positive or HIV positive today. This is some data I'm seeing based on what I'm reading. So just to go back during that time, a 40-year-old may not remember, and even a 50-year-old may not remember, if you go back to it. So you would have to be in your mid-50s to kind of remember how the news, the media, and you have to follow it to kind of know what happened. Mm-hmm. When HIV happened, if you can kind of tell us the conditions when it happened, what was the news saying? What was the media saying? How afraid were people? What kind of reactions did we have? Just think about the average person that wasn't there at that time. Was there a pandemic? Was it a shutdown? Did they shut down the government? What happened? Give us that point of view during that time. You're in it.
Yeah, I'm in it. In fact, it's directly related to me because Frank said to me, Judy, are you afraid? I don't want to put you, we don't know anything about this. We're isolating the virus. So all we know is healthy young men are getting all these strange diseases and dying. They're cachectic, they're thin, they look like cancer patients. Their immune systems are destroyed. And then you're going to try to isolate a virus. I'm literally handling them. And what do they do to them? Don't touch them. It was just like my grandfather. Don't tell him he has cancer because we don't know
Mm.
how it causes. Don't touch them. Don't hug them. Think about everything we're talking about today. Stay 6 feet away. The psychological trauma to the patients. You know, don't hug them. Don't touch them. At the time, I left the cancer. Well, I'll just, it was that kind of thing. But it was only them. And they said, it's only them. It's their bad behavior. It's the gays, it's the IV drug users, it's prostitutes. That's God's that's punishment for their behavior. So a country of Christians, you know, said, oh, bad people. And I remember so clearly going to scientific meetings, and I fell prey to the culture myself. And I can say 30 years later, I'm ashamed of myself. But that I went to meetings where there were protesters that blocked the scientists from going into the meeting, and they're saying scientists are murderers, or what the science says. And I thought to myself, I'm working 24/7 to find a cure for your bad behavior, and you're throwing, they used to throw balloons full of red fluid that were condoms full of red fluids at you at a baseball stadium in a meeting in Montreal. This was maybe 1990. So I went to these meetings as scientists, and I didn't realize we had all kinds of posters of treatments that would work. And we weren't the government keeping them from getting these treatments. We were, you know, we were just scientists doing our job. And I think it really shows what's going on now as the media spins something. And now we have healthy people afraid of healthy people, especially healthy children. You know, we're all wearing masks and have to stay 6 feet away. And the masks are injuring ourselves. So this was the culture in literally from 1980s through, and I didn't want a PhD. I actually left the Cancer Institute. I wasn't going to go back to graduate school. And the stories are all told in Plague of Corruption, because we walked through my life. And I went to work at a pharmaceutical company, Upjohn, and we were making some good drugs and doing some things, but we had to understand if the biological therapies would be contaminated if they had animal or human blood in them. And I simply did the test to spike it with a lot of HIV, and then ask if the process, the manufacturing process, could remove 6 logs of infectivity. That is, if the virus was there, if even one contaminated unit of blood or whatever we were using, animal tissue, had a virus there, we could pull it out with the process. And what Upjohn did with me is I had to do those experiments back in Frank's lab in the National Cancer Institute, because they said, we don't have HIV in Michigan. So for years, in 1987, remember I isolated in 1983. So for years, there's no HIV. It's only those people, until Arthur Ashe and Ryan White, until the little boy, the hemophiliac, multiply transfused, until Arthur Ashe got a heart transplant and acquired. And this is the subject of the movie and the book, The Band Played On, by Randy Shilts. And so, you know, and that's how I wrote this book. How we wrote these 2 books was to go through what we knew. So the fact that is what I call the God thing, that Frank and Versetti and I stayed together all these years. I left Upjohn because my other project was to show that bovine growth hormone, that is making GMOs, making cows make more milk by engineering the GMO, bovine growth hormone, some called it somatostat, to make more milk, wouldn't hurt human cells. And my work said anything but. My work said it absolutely hurt human cells. It can drive diabetes. It can drive adipocytes to the explosion of obesity we see. And of course, you know, GMOs do that. And